Hi, this is Matt Baker, and welcome to a very special collaboration between Useful Charts, that's me, and fellow Vancouver YouTuber JJ McCullough. The two of us are going to be discussing the topic, should monarchies still exist in the 21st century? In his video, JJ is going to answer no, and in this video, I am going to answer yes. So after watching my arguments, you should head over to JJ's channel and watch his video. And just to let you know, JJ and I did work together on this and compare scripts. So although we're not using a traditional back and forth debate format, we will be addressing each other's main points. So let's begin. First off, let me be clear about what I am not going to argue for. I am not going to argue that monarchy is the best form of government, because that's simply not the topic. The topic is, should monarchies still exist? In other words, should monarchy be an option? And to that, I say yes. Please note that I will also not be arguing that the Canadian monarchy should exist. Both JJ and I happen to be citizens of Canada, which happens to have a monarchy. But again, that's not the topic we've chosen. The topic we've chosen is, should monarchies still exist in general? In other words, should they be able to exist somewhere in the world? So again, my answer to that is yes. And here are my two main reasons. First, monarchies should still exist because there are still countries in the world today in which the majority of their citizens want to have a monarchy. And second, monarchies should still exist because of the various forms of government, there is currently no option available that is overwhelmingly better than that of a parliamentary monarchy. Okay, so let me explain these 2 points in greater detail. And let me start by asking a question. What is the opposite of a monarchy? If you answered a democracy, you're wrong. The opposite of a monarchy is a republic. A lot of people assume that the words democracy and republic mean exactly the same thing, but they don't. A republic, like a monarchy, is a form of government. A monarchy has a king, or something similar to a king, and a republic does not. On the other hand, democracy refers to the amount of control that the general population has over the running of their country. So pitting monarchy against democracy as if they were two opposing options is very misleading. If we combine the idea of democracy with the monarchy versus republic divide, we actually end up with 4 options. First, there are democratic monarchies, also known as parliamentary monarchies, such as the UK. Then there are democratic republics, such as the United States. On the flip side, there are also undemocratic monarchies, better known as absolute monarchies, such as Saudi Arabia. And then finally, we also have undemocratic republics, such as North Korea. Those are usually called dictatorships. So if your main complaint against monarchies is that they are undemocratic, that's simply not true. If you take a look at democracy index scores, which is a measure of how democratic a nation is, you'll see that there is no obvious correlation between monarchy and how democratic or undemocratic a country is. Among the top 10 most democratic countries, you'll find both monarchies, such as Norway and Sweden, as well as republics, such as Finland and Ireland. And at the bottom, you'll also find both monarchies, such as Oman and Eswatini, as well as republics, such as Congo or Syria. But what about the monarchs themselves? Because you might be thinking, sure, a country with a monarchy can be democratic, but having a king or queen is in itself an undemocratic act. After all, kings and queens are almost always born into the job rather than elected. This is a point that JJ brings up in his video. Well, to that argument, I'd point out the fact that nowadays, most kings and queens do not hold on to their position due to their control of the military. In reality, they hold on to their position due to their popularity. In parliamentary monarchies, journalists and everyday citizens are free to state their opinions about the monarchy, and there is always a general sense of how popular the monarchy currently is. Here's the thing. There are a lot of countries today in which their monarchies are well-liked and supported by the people. Take, for example, Japan. Recent polls indicate that around 80% of Japanese citizens want to keep their monarchy. That might not be the 100% that JJ seems to think should be required, but it's still really high and has remained consistent. It's much higher than what any party-based politician could ever dream of maintaining. In Japan, the emperor is an entirely ceremonial position and is strongly linked to Japanese traditions as well as the Shinto religion, both of which go back thousands of years. Look, I am not Japanese. If Japan scores high on the democracy index, which it does, and if 80% of Japanese citizens are happy with their monarchy, which they are, then who am I to say that the Japanese monarchy should not exist? The next thing I want to talk about is the variety of options available when it comes to forms of government. Because to boil it all down to monarchies versus republics is actually an oversimplification. In order to understand the many different options available, you first need to know the following two terms: head of state and head of government. These are two positions that every country in the world has. A head of state is a person who represents an entire country in a symbolic way. They embody the country as a whole, and thus end up acting as the public face of that country. On the other hand, a head of government is a person who is responsible for the day-to-day running of the government. In some cases, the head of state and the head of government is the same person, but in other cases, they are two different people. So this means we can have several different arrangements. Let's go through some of them. On the republic side, we can have a system whereby the head of state and the head of government is the same person. This is called a presidential system, and the example that you're probably most familiar with is the United States, although it is also used by countries such as Brazil, Turkey, and the Philippines. However, it's also possible to have a republic in which the head of state and the head of government are two different people. This is called a parliamentary republic, and examples include Germany, India, and Israel. Finally, there's also a middle-of-the-road approach. This is called a semi-presidential system, and here the head of state controls most aspects of running the country, but then there's also a separate head of government that controls other parts. For example, in France, where they use this system, the head of state has more control over foreign affairs, and the head of government has more control over domestic affairs, particularly if they come from opposing parties. Let's now look at the monarchy side. I've already mentioned parliamentary monarchies. As you might have guessed, these are basically the equivalent of parliamentary republics. The only difference is that the head of state is a monarch. But in practical terms, they are actually very similar in that the head of state is an entirely ceremonial position, and there's a separate head of government that actually runs the country. In the 21st century, most monarchies fall into this category, which, unlike what JJ says, proves that monarchies are reformable. Absolute monarchies, which are rare nowadays, are kind of the equivalent of presidential systems, because in an absolute monarchy, the monarch is both the head of state and the head of government. The important difference, of course, is that a country with a presidential system can vote out their leader, whereas in an absolute monarchy, they cannot. Finally, there is a type of monarchy that is kind of similar to the semi-presidential system. It exists in countries like Morocco and Jordan. In those countries, There is a separate head of government, but the king still maintains quite a bit of control. Now, personally, I agree that absolute monarchies and semi-absolute monarchies should not exist. But being that parliamentary monarchies are very close in style to parliamentary republics, I don't see why the option to have a monarch as one's ceremonial head of state should be taken off the table, especially considering that there are countries with very strong democracies that want to have that option. Which leads me to my second point. I don't think that any of the three republic-based systems are overwhelmingly better than that of the parliamentary monarchy system. In other words, I do recognize that parliamentary monarchies have their problems, but I also think that the other three systems do as well. For example, the primary role of a head of state is to represent an entire country on the world stage and to embody that country in a symbolic way. Under a presidential system or a semi-presidential system, this becomes difficult because that person also represents a specific political party and is thus unable to represent their country in a non-partisan way. The US is a good example. Over the last several years, there were many Americans that were not happy that this man was the symbol of America. Likewise, there are many Americans today that are not happy that this man is now the symbol. In addition to this, it has been argued that the President of the United States has so much power that he or she is closer to being a real monarch than a monarch in a parliamentary monarchy. And if your response to that is, well, the US gets to kick out their quote-unquote monarch every 4 years if they want to. Well, let me just say, that was something that a lot of people were suddenly not too sure about not too long ago. Look, I'm not saying that presidential and semi-presidential systems are horrible. I'm simply saying that they're not perfect. They're not overwhelmingly better than the two parliamentary options. Likewise, I don't think that a parliamentary republic is overwhelmingly better than a parliamentary monarchy. Not in all cases, anyway. Remember, the primary function of a head of state is to be a symbol for his or her country. Usually, a monarch makes a much better symbol than a non-monarch. For example, most people around the world can easily name the head of state of the United Kingdom. However, very few people outside of India can name the head of state of India. They can probably name this guy, Narendra Modi, but they cannot name this guy, Ramnath Kovind. Now, like I say, having a hereditary monarch as one's symbolic leader may not always be a good idea. For example, take my own country, Canada. Canada is a very multicultural country with a very diverse heritage. Therefore, having a monarch that symbolizes only one aspect of that heritage is problematic. It also serves as a painful reminder of our colonial past, especially for Indigenous people. But in other contexts, I think it can be appropriate, particularly in countries with long histories, like Japan or Sweden, so long as the people there continue to support having a monarchy within a democratic framework. Before I go, I want to address one more thing. What about the fact that one person or one family being born into a level of wealth and prestige far above that of the average citizen is simply unfair, like grossly unfair? Well, actually, I concede that point, because I agree that having a really large income inequality is something that we should try to avoid as a society. But I think that focusing on monarchies is a case of missing the forest for the trees. Earlier, I brought up the democracy index. Well, I'd now like to bring up the Gini index, which is a measure used to compare countries in terms of overall income inequality. Like when it comes to democracy, there is no obvious correlation between having a monarchy as a form of government and income inequality. Some monarchies, such as Norway, are among those with the lowest inequality in the world, and others, such as Eswatini, are among the highest in terms of inequality. If you compare the so-called developed countries only, the country that has the most income inequality on that list is actually the United States. Consider this fact. There are currently 2,000 individuals in the United States who have a net worth higher than that of Queen Elizabeth. The richest person in that group, Jeff Bezos, has 300 times as much wealth as the Queen. So if your primary concern is reducing income inequality, then I think it's safe to say that getting rid of monarchs should not be your top priority. Now, you might argue that those 2,000 Americans who are richer than the Queen deserve their money because they earned it through hard work. Well, unlike what Hollywood likes to tell us, rags to riches stories are actually not very common. Most wealthy people in the world today are wealthy because they too were born into wealth and/or privilege. So, yeah, I'm not saying that monarchy is the perfect form of government. I admit, monarchies do have their problems, but so do republics. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a form of republic that is so far superior to that of a parliamentary monarchy that it's worth saying that all monarchies should simply cease to exist, especially considering that there are several very democratic countries who still want to have them. So there you have it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and be sure to check out JJ's video arguing for the opposite position. You can find that link on the screen right now or in the description. Thanks for watching.